and hopefully reach agreement on at least a few of them. So we are going to be recording this, and I will turn it over to Ed to present.
As the main perpetrator of the meeting, I guess I'll introduce it by framing the history of this project, because many of you who are here, and by the way, this is I think probably the biggest number of people we've ever had in this room at one time. This meeting was actually the next step in a process that actually began back in 1998, when Jim and Bruce and Emily and I were invited out to Esalen by Mike Murphy, who was co-founder of that beautiful place. Mike, it turned out, had read F.W.H. Myers, the entire 1,400 pages of it, and understood that if survival actually occurs, post-mortem survival, that is, then the prevailing modern view that dominates not only central parts of science, but even the humanities and civilization in general, and could be seen as a main source of our various problems, which are getting worse rapidly, and that is physicalism. This is what we all grew up with as kids in elementary school even, and from then on, except for those who are actually in physics, who know it's not true. And it says basically that, space and time were just there from the beginning, absolute, nice convenient container for events and stuff. Things are made out of smaller things all the way down to some bottom level where there's little tiny stuff flying around under the influence of fields of force, unconscious, dead basically, and everything else has to be manufactured from that. So we're nothing but incredibly complicated biological machines operating deterministically. Our sense of ourselves as conscious agents with some degree of free will is just an illusion. Everything in mind and consciousness is in fact manufactured by neurophysiological stuff in our brains. So when we die, that's it, lights out, no possibility of any form of post-mortem survival. So Mike basically wanted to hear, he knew that there are people here and there, including those of us at DOPS, who are generating evidence suggestive that that's not right, and that at least under some circumstances, some of us survive for some period of time under largely unknown circumstances. It might be very little that's been learned so far, but it's enough to put a kind of foot in the door. Mike saw clearly that this is a theoretical watershed. If survival really happens, physicalism is false, period. So anyway, we got together. There were about 20 of us to start with, and we began presenting and talking about the existing evidence for survival. The form of these meetings, by the way, is once a year for about a week out at Esalen, fantastic place perched on a hill over the Pacific Ocean. Absolutely beautiful physical setting. If Mike Murphy had accomplished nothing else in his life, that would have been a great career already, but that's just the beginning for him. After the second year, it had become clear that we had somewhat differing opinions about survival, but we were all convinced that physicalism is false, and we hatched a kind of plot to subvert it. It had two phases. The first was to try and assemble in one place a lot of evidence, empirical evidence, showing that physicalism is just not up to the job of explaining stuff about us, important things. And then the second phase would be to try to figure out, or at least get a sense of direction about where a better science-based worldview might go. So the whole process so far has led to three large books. The first one was Irreducible Mind, and I know a lot of you already know all this, but some don't, so bear with me, please. And the main purpose of that book was to really assemble in one place lots of this evidence, and for that purpose, we revisited a book published by F.W.H. Myers in 1903, posthumously, called Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. Emily did her dissertation on Myers at Edinburgh, and he was headed in the same kind of direction, we revisited a number of the topics that he had studied and written about, and a bunch of other things that have happened since his time. And the net result of all that is, I think the evidence we assembled should be sufficient to persuade anybody with a reasonably open mind that yes, there are big problems for physicalism, starting with the kinds of phenomena that we study, but certainly not restricted to that. I mean, they even include things as fundamental as consciousness itself. At this point in time, after a century or so of serious neuroscience, as Jerry Fodor once put it, nobody has the slightest idea what it would mean to have the slightest idea of how a brain produces consciousness. This is also a guy who, by the way, in response to connectionist models of the mind, remarked that that's what's great about cognitive science. You can go away for a couple of centuries, come back, nothing's really changed. Anyway, so that was kind of the easy part. It was a gigantic clerical job. But then came the hard part, which is what's to replace it. And again, we milled around for a couple of years trying to figure out how to approach that. And we finally decided that within the limits of our small group of people, and who knew what about what kind of thing, we would try to inventory a number of world historical worldviews or conceptual frameworks or metaphysical systems that took the existence of our rogue phenomena seriously. And by this, let me say, I mean, especially at this point, things like all the psi phenomena, postmortem survival, genius, consciousness, including mystical states of consciousness, which we gradually came to feel have been really unfairly ignored by modern science. I mean, basically, the response of modern Western science has been primarily to ignore the subject. And among the few people who have looked at it, the general response has been to pathologize and diminish it. So now, before I get into the actual theory part, let me mention that another of the main effects, I think, of irreducible mind is to provide a great deal more evidence for the kind of psychological model that Myers and his colleague William James especially were advancing around the turn of the 20th century, 19th to 20th century, over 125 years ago or so. Whereas virtually everybody today, in neuroscience and psychology in particular, presume that everyday consciousness is all the consciousness there is in each of us, supported by unconscious stuff going on in our brains. Myers and James had a different idea. There's a bigger consciousness of which everyday consciousness is a small portion. That larger consciousness has capacities that our regular consciousness normally can't access, but under certain special circumstances can. And in particular, it's the kind of source of human potentials such as the psi phenomena, genius, mystical experiences, stuff that's really important for humanity. And without going much further in that direction, let me just say that I think there's a lot of evidence that picture really holds together, and we know how to develop it further empirically. This is exactly the kind of stuff, for example, that our neuroimaging lab downstairs is intended to help us investigate. That is, find out what's going on in the brain when someone succeeds at a psi task or is, having an out-of-body experience or something of that sort. Now, back to the theory. I won't go into the nitty-gritty details, but after several years of beating on the subject, we arrived at a kind of sense of direction, I would say, about where to look. And that is, well, let me say first that we had a number of physicists, including Bernard was one, from a relativistic string theory's point of view, had a couple of quantum theorists, Henry Stapp and Harold Ottmansbacher, who's all tied up with the Jung and Pauli dialogue and all that. We had some scholars of religion who were familiar with various mystically informed religious philosophies, and we had people who could investigate and report on Western philosophers such as Leibniz and Peirce and Whitehead, who had a big presence at Esalen and has been largely ignored. I think he had the misfortune to show up just about the time that philosophers were deciding that speculative philosophy is not to be done. Sharon knows very well. So what we ended up with was a sense, for me, built mainly around the work that William James did in the latter part of his career, deliberately building upon Myers's model of human personality. He hinted at this a little bit in his Ingersoll lecture on two supposed objections to the doctrine of immortality, where he first proposed this kind of filter picture or permission model of how the larger consciousness can shape what goes on in everyday consciousness. In varieties of religious experiences, he was much more explicit about it, particularly right at the end, and kind of hinted about where he was going. And then in his the last book published in his lifetime, A Pluralistic Universe, based on a series of lectures he gave at Oxford, he really put forward the full picture, in which he generalizes Myers' model in such a way that there might be, we just don't know, a kind of hierarchy of progressively more comprehensive consciousnesses terminating in something less than the sort of absolutes of the sorts of absolute idealism that were still prevalent at the time. And that, it turns out, is one example of a more general family of doctrines known as evolutionary panentheism. I won't go into detail about what that is, but at that point, I mean, most of us were kind of on that train, so to speak. The main exception, by the way, was Harold Ottmanspacher, who had a somewhat different picture based on the Jung-Pauli stuff. But clearly, at that point, what we need to do is, identify more schemes of this type and really get serious about trying to compare them and so on. We produced a further book. Well, there were two further books. The first one was Beyond Physicalism, Toward Reconciliation of Science and Spirituality. And that was where we first proposed this kind of general sense of direction. The next book, Consciousness Unbound, Federico Faggin here contributed to that, along with a bunch of other new people. So we had a number of additional systems of the same general type. We also had state of the science summaries in there for precognition, cases of the reincarnation type, and near-death experiences. And our first real effort to begin thinking about what this all means for larger departments of the world, like the humanities, for example, consciousness research, David Presti from Berkeley, and Jeff Kripal wrote about the humanities. And Paul Marshall then, at the end of that book, has a masterful survey of the whole metaphysical landscape of the positions that we regard as still standing, so to speak, leaving aside stuff like physicalism. So by this time, what I became convinced we need to do is to find, this evolutionary panentheism, it's a form of idealism. It needs to be a realist idealism that somehow takes into account what we learned over the centuries in physics, including more modern physics than what conventional physicalism is based on. So I began looking around now, who can support this kind of a further, deeper investigation in a narrower sector of this big spectrum of possible positions. And it wasn't long after Irreducible Mind, after the last book, actually, that I got an invitation to be a discussant for this book, written by this gentleman right here, Tim Eastman. It's called Untying the Gordian Knot, in which he presents, after decades of serious thought, aside from his day job as a space plasma physicist, about how our science-based picture of reality should be expanded in order to allow it to accommodate lots of extra stuff, including specifically the kinds of rogue phenomena that we had cataloged in Irreducible Mind. So, hey, this is a guy I got to learn about, right? So I read it twice now. It's quite a difficult book for those. It's mainly driven by physics, math, logic, and related disciplines. Whereas, of course, we had come at it mainly from psychology, neuroscience, and a little bit of philosophy. Let's see. Of course, Bernard had already been identified as a person having a picture based in physics, which clearly can accommodate a lot of the same sort of designed to, in fact, accommodate the sorts of phenomena we want to study. I had made Federico's acquaintance, and his is actually in some ways the one that's overtly closest to the Myers, James, Sursand, as we called ourselves, Esalen picture. And Ruth, it turns out, has provided a lot of the kind of physics input to Tim's system. So, and Bob has been with us for a long time, and as I said, was the author of the precognition chapter in Consciousness Unbound. So that was a natural group. Emily came along because she's been tracking this whole process from the beginning. She and Adam Crabtree and I are among the most frequent members of the Esalen group. So what I would like to do at this point is just to turn it over to our various participants, starting with our presenters. We had, 4 big sessions, basically half a day each, with lots of conversation. And the rest of us can chip in afterward. So should we go in the same order we went in? That would be Federico first.
Wow. So, why did I get into this mess? I'm a physicalist, or at least I was a physicalist. I graduated in physics. I invented a few things, and essentially my life was going good. But after achieving everything that the world says that if you do, you should be happy, I was not happy. And it took me a while to actually acknowledge that I wasn't happy. In fact, I was keeping it, hidden until I had to say, no, I'm not happy, and I'm pretending to be happy. I was running a company at the time. I started several companies, and I had to, to be, obviously on top. And but deep inside, there was an ever more sinking feeling, and I didn't know why. Having achieved everything that should make you happy, in some way, I was betrayed by physicalism. It says that if you do all these things, you check all those boxes, you should be happy. And it was in this milieu that this mindset, at that time of my company, I was studying neural networks, to study neuroscience, biology, trying to understand how the brain works and making computers that actually can learn by themselves, like we do, like our brain does. That was AI back in 86, 87, 88. And it turns out that in studying neuroscience books, I realized that consciousness was never mentioned. And what happens in our brain was described purely in physicalist terms. So this, stuff that goes on, and this happens, and this happens, and so on. So eventually, if I put a piece of chocolate in my mouth, I eventually recognize the chocolate. That's all to it. And I asked myself, but wait a second, the taste of chocolate, where is it coming from? I recognize the chocolate because of the taste, which is a feeling, a sensation that The books never talk about feeling and sensation. Those books only talk about electrical signals, biochemical signals, and that's it. And that's when I discovered the hard problem of consciousness, the fact that we do not understand how you go from electrical signals into sensations and feelings, what philosophers call qualia. And at that time also I understood that consciousness, my problem was a problem of consciousness. Why was, being happy or being sad or unhappy is a problem of consciousness. Why does the brain need consciousness if it has to only, shuffle around electrical signals like a computer? There is no need for consciousness. But we do have consciousness, and consciousness serves a very important purpose for us. According to science, to the model in which consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain, consciousness is simply irrelevant and unnecessary. And it was in this milieu that I had this extraordinary experience of consciousness that turned my way upside down. It basically revealed that I'm not what I thought. I'm not separate from the world. I'm actually a portion of the world, a part of the world that sees the world, and the world is me. What I see is actually me. But I also see you, and I see everybody else. So what's going on in this picture? How can I be a part whole? How can I be a part that contains the potentiality of all? And this journey brought me to a beginning of a theory of consciousness after 20 years of work, personal work, to understand consciousness experientially, because that's how we know. We know by experiencing. We do not know by reading books. If we read book and we understand, it's because we already have understanding. Otherwise, we would not understand. This is an important point because, for example, if I taste something that you never tasted and I describe it to you, you cannot understand it. You cannot reproduce the taste that I'm describing. But if you already know the taste, then you understand. So the meaning comes before the symbols. The symbols that describe what I'm talking about. If you don't understand them, what good are they for? Well, it turns out that information in physics has nothing to do with meaning. It's only to do with the probability that symbols appear. Does that make sense?
No.
What do you think? So my theory then clearly understood, like many others for that matter, that quantum physics that has properties completely different than classical physics upon which physicalism is based. Physicalism assumes essentially that the world that we live is described by classical physics, which is deterministic. But that's not the way the world is. The real world, the more fundamental world, is indeterministic. That's described by quantum physics. So that world then must have something to do with consciousness, because consciousness without free will would be silly. What good does it do to you to know what's going on, to know what you want, and then you cannot do anything about it? And that's what physics is saying. We are machines. So if we are conscious of what's going on, the decision is made by the brain independent from our consciousness. Consciousness is really, a kind of the cream over the
froth on the way.
the froth over whatever chocolate. But the real stuff is the chocolate. And so anyway, I'm taking too much time, so I got to run.
Okay.
So I go right to the theory. The theory down, I try to, like any scientist, to explain consciousness based on some other thing, like quantum physics. I was trying to use quantum physics to explain consciousness. And of course, I came close. But then 6 months ago, I said to myself, wait a second. I cannot, I'm using the mathematics that is a theory that describes quantum physics. to describe consciousness when it's consciousness that creates the mathematics. So what's wrong with this picture? I have to turn this thing around. I have to start with consciousness and free will, and then explain why quantum physics has the crazy properties that it has, that physicists have been unable to understand in the last 100 years. The collapse of the wave function, the superposition of states that allows cats to be alive and dead at the same time, and all this kind of stuff. And in fact, and I stop here, this theory explains exactly why these properties must exist in nature, because they reflect the fact that consciousness and free will exist from the beginning. Very simply, the quantum state, which is the way you start with quantum physics, is a state that describes probability amplitudes in an n-dimensional space with complex spaces. And I don't want to go, I'm sure you don't want me to tell you more about this, but it's a very sophisticated structure, mathematical structure. That structure has exactly the property of a conscious experience, because that structure cannot be reproduced. There is a no cloning theorem that says that the quantum state of a system cannot be reproduced. You can reproduce the information of a computer, but not the quantum state. So it has the same properties of my conscious experience that is only mine. I cannot give you what I feel, and you cannot give me what I feel. You have to translate what you feel into symbols that are shareable. That's the classical information, bits. So if I feel love, I cannot transfer the love that I feel to you. I can say, I love you. But I love you symbols. Everybody understands them. But to transfer what I feel, impossible. The other thing is that what I feel is always much more than what I can say with words. Another property that is not in the computer. The computer, everything that it knows can be reproduced, not a little bit of it. Not in quantum physics. So those properties are properties of consciousness. The last property of quantum physics, that is a property of consciousness, is free will. Free will is actually what a field does when it decides to show. And what to show is a free will decision in this, as opposed to a collapse of the wave function, that there is no theory about it, which is what science now tells us that happens. Because quantum physics can only tell us the probability of all the possible states that might manifest, but it cannot tell us the state that will manifest. So how come that there is one state, but the theory can only give you the probability of the possibilities? The probability of the possibilities is not science the way classical physics is. Classical physics tells you the next position, velocity of the particle, tells you the trajectory, everything that you need to know. Not quantum physics. The only way to explain this, if you are conscious, is that there is free will. If you're not conscious, it doesn't make any sense. That's why scientists say it is a random, non-algorithmic event. But once you show that there is consciousness, then that phenomenon is a diffusion of free will. It is the only way you can explain it. And I'll stop here. Thanks.
Well, maybe I should start off with a historical anecdote just to explain why I'm standing here. When I was 15, I was at a British public school called Harrow. It's a boarding school, and I misbehaved. I won't go into the details. And as a result of that, I was roomed, which meant that I had to stay in my room apart from lessons. So I had nothing to do. So I read 3 books in that week. One of the books was by Bertrand Russell. It was on relativity theory, and that got me interested in physics and space and time. The other book was An Experiment with Time by J.W. Dunn, where he talked about his precognitive dreams and his theory of time to explain them. That got me interested in psychical research. The third book was called Third Eye by Lobsang Rampa, who was supposed to be a Tibetan Lama who'd taken over the body of a Cornish fisherman.
From Brooklyn.
From books. Yeah. But that got me interested in religious experience and the links between mystical experience and psychic phenomena. And those three books really determined the direction of my life for the next 60 years. And because I just became fascinated in both science, psychical research, and religious experience. And I essentially decided that I wanted to spend my life trying to link those three worlds, the three worlds, if you like, matter, mind, psyche, and spirituality. Then when I went to Cambridge, I studied mathematics. And at the end of my degree, I had to decide what to do my PhD in. Because although I was studying maths, I was fascinated. I spent a lot of time, more time actually, doing psychical research, and I was a member of the Buddhist Society. And the big decision was, do I become a parapsychologist or do I become a cosmologist? Well, in the end, I decided I couldn't become a parapsychologist because there were no jobs in those days. This is way back in early 1970s. But I was so inspired by, for example, Ian Stevenson, who founded this. I spent a summer with him here. So I decided I'd become a professional cosmologist. I was very lucky because I did my PhD with Stephen Hawking, who, of course, became quite famous, and he was also very brilliant. So that got me off to a good start. And then in my professional career, which I became a cosmologist, studying at university, and eventually started at Cambridge, then I went to London. But all the time I was working on these respectable things, like the Big Bang Theory, which everybody believes, except few people. I said that as a joke to Tim, but cosmology is also very speculative. But all this time I was also working in secret, really, on my dream, which was to expand physics to accommodate psychic and spiritual phenomena. And I thought that was really important because I'm passionate about physics. And although physicalism, going beyond physicalism, make it sound as though one is knocking physics, I'm passionate about physics. I don't think it's got the whole story, but I feel it's been tremendously successful. And precisely because of that, I feel it's crucial to expand physics to accommodate the sort of phenomena of interest to us here today, psychic and spiritual phenomena. Because the whole point about psi is it does involve an interaction between consciousness and the physical world. And so if physics is complete, you've got to expand it. The only trouble is that it's a rather uncomfortable position because most physicists don't believe in psychic phenomena, or at least say they're nothing to do with physics. And many people interested in mysticism or psychic phenomena aren't that keen to explain them in terms of physics because they feel it's too reductionist. But I've always disagreed with that. I felt you have to make a bridge between physics and these other phenomena, and really that's what I've always aimed to do. Now, I have to say that for most of my life, I was doing this in secret, partly because I knew my professional colleagues would be very dismissive. They might think I was crazy, or even more crazy than I am. But also because, to be honest, I wasn't particularly keen in converting my physics colleagues that they should be interested in psychic and spiritual phenomena. It was my personal quest, but I didn't feel any sort of evangelical zeal. And to be honest, if I had been more open about it, it would have, I don't think I would have lost my job, but it would certainly have affected my professional career. Well, what happened? Various things happened. First of all, I met Ed, and Ed invited me to the CERSEM meetings for several years at Eastman. And I got to realize that actually I'm part of a much bigger community of people who are, in some sense, are all rebels, I suppose, in terms of the conventional academic perspective, all sharing the same dream, which is to go beyond the normal physical paradigm. and or to expand the normal physical paradigm. The other thing that happened was that I retired. Okay, I retired about 3 years ago, which means I can't lose my job. So I sort of come out and talk about these things. I think the other thing that has happened is that there has been, in the 50 odd years which I've been interested in this subject, there has been a change in even the nature of physics. You see, within science more generally, there are various topics which are taboo. At least they're traditionally taboo. But you find that as history, as physics, as science goes on, fashions change, and what was taboo becomes acceptable. And an obvious example of this is consciousness. Now, 20 years ago, a physicist couldn't have talked about consciousness. It would be regarded not necessarily, as you said, the fluff. You know, consciousness, we're purely passive observers. And to say that consciousness was fundamental or part of physics would be regarded as heretical. So, not necessarily because consciousness exists, but simply because it wasn't part of physics, because physics is dealing with the third person perspective. But there's been a change in just, I would say, something like the last 20 years. Now, because of developments in physics, quantum theory, which Federico has explained next to consciousness, developments in neuroscience. Now we have these huge meetings every year about the physics of consciousness, developments in AI, and all sorts of other reasons. So consciousness is no longer a taboo word. And so, although Federico is very brave in promoting his particular theory of consciousness and quantum theory, which I, of course, am very happy with. I agree with his approach broadly. The fact of the matter is that you can now talk about consciousness without getting into trouble.
Yep.
So Federico is safe. Yep. But there are other subjects which are still taboo. That you can't really talk about parapsychology in most quarters within the physical community. And that's, some people even say, some physicists will say, well, psi cannot be real because it's inconsistent with physics, incompatible with physics. And to be honest, that is simply nonsense, because we don't have a final theory of physics. Okay, we've got quantum theory on the microscopic domain, we've got relativity on the macroscopic domain. And it's true that those theories alone do not allow, I would say, don't even allow consciousness, let alone psychic phenomena. However, we know that's not the final theory of physics. We know there has to be a final theory of physics which marries up relativity and quantum theory. And that's where, in my opinion, you're going to have consciousness and psychic and spiritual phenomena. That's at least my belief. That's what I'm really assuming when I try and expand physics. So whatever this expanded physics is, and you might not want to call it physics, because after all, the second book is called Beyond Physicalism, but that's a matter of semantics. But the nature of physics is always changing over the centuries, and it's what I at least call it's some form of expanded form of physics. And so that's what I feel passionately we have to do. And I think the time is ripe for this paradigm shift. It's a paradigm shift. I'm talking about physics, but it's in science more generally. Because, as you know, a paradigm shift involves all aspects of many academic disciplines, physics, philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, and all of culture. And I think we're on the verge of what is sometimes called a post-materialist paradigm, because it's going beyond the pure material world. Most physicists assume that really the only reality is the material. I will imitate Federico, that assumes that the only reality is this material reality. But the whole lesson, I think, from subjects we're interested in, the road phenomena, is that there are other levels of reality. And the only question is, can those other level of reality, can they be described by physics? Now, I don't have time to say what my own approach is. I'll just say it in just a couple of sentences, because I spent many hours, I'm afraid, talking about it at this conference. But for me, the final theory, a key feature of the final theory is going to be the fact that there are higher dimensions And this comes from physics itself, from M theory, where besides the 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time, there have to be these extra dimensions which explain the various forces of nature and give a unified picture of the physical world. These extra dimensions, you don't see them because they're wrapped up very small, but they are supposed to be there according to these theories. And in my approach at least, these higher dimensions play a crucial role in accommodating not just consciousness, which is what Federico referred to, but the whole domain of mental experience. And in just one sentence, I argue that all the various mental experiences which we're interested in, I mean, dreams, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, ghosts, various forms of mystical experiences, I argue they all require some form of higher dimensional space. In some of these respectable, inverted commas, theories of physics, M theory, our physical world is just a 4-dimensional slice of this higher dimensional space. The slice is called the brain, B-R-A-N-E, and the higher dimensional space is called the bulk. And so that's coming from physics, okay, perfectly respectable. Doesn't mean everybody believes it. I mean, not everybody here believes it, but it comes from respectable physicists. So the question is simply, if the world is a slice of a higher dimensional space, what else is there? Well, the only thing I'm aware of is my mental, psychic, and spiritual experiences. So basically, in a nutshell, my particular vision of this paradigm is that there is higher dimensional space, of which the physical world is just a small part. Now, I'm not going to say this theory is correct. It's really the same theory I had when I was 15, when I had this passion, you know. I sort of felt this somehow intuitively. I felt this is the answer to how to expand physics. And I suppose I spent the last 60 years trying to sort of fill it out. You know, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and think, yes, this is true. I'm sure it's true. Other times I wake up in the middle of the night and think, no, this is crazy. Absolutely crazy. But so I'm not going to say this is the right theory. But I mean, all I can say is I think it's Emily who made this remark last night. It's the question which is important rather than the answer, perhaps. So, and it's true, actually, most theories of physics are wrong in the end. They just turn out to be steps on the way. So this is my passion. If my theory is wrong, then I've wasted 50 years, but that's true in cosmology. And I just say it's my passion. And I should say that everyone here is approaching the problem in a different way. And I think they're complementary. So my emphasis is somewhat different from Federico's, but I think it's perfectly compatible with what he says. He also mentioned higher dimensions. He's talking about higher dimensions associated with Hilbert space and quantum theory. And I, having spoken, I know to Tim and Ruth over the weekend, I know there's a lot in common with our perspectives. We don't agree on everything, but you know, that's more exciting. That's much more interesting. If everybody agrees, it will be rather dull. So anyway, they will now have a chance to speak. And thank you very much for listening to me. And thank you very much for.
Can I just say one thing on this question of agreement and whether we're right or wrong and all? We have to remember the Hindu model of the elephant.
Yes.
We talked about that we all get these different perspectives and these different descriptions of the question or of the reality that we're aiming for. None of them are really wrong. They're just limited. Yeah. So I don't think it's a question of right or wrong. It's a question of expanding.
Exactly. I'm grabbing onto a bit of the elephant.
Right.
The important thing, there is an elephant.
There is an elephant.
I'm Tim Eastman, and I grew up on a farm in western Minnesota. I went to a country school for a couple of years with a class of 2, myself and Sharon. And so went on to the big school in a nearby town of 20 students in the class. And so this, so that kind of a modest beginning of things. But also reinforced in my own experience of, the ordinariness of things. And also, and in that ordinariness, a quest for who am I and what's this world about and what's in the next county and what's beyond that. And so I had somewhat of a spiritual experience when I was about age 13 at a class picnic. I went off to the side and just sort of overwhelming sense of my radical finiteness relative to the radical inclusiveness of things, my radical ignorance of things. And so that's kind of my beginning of my quest. And so then so I think that we're now in the process of coming into the 21st century, you're trying to work out a new natural philosophy that can be adequate to the wealth of experience and of the theoretical developments for the past few centuries and developments in philosophy. That's issues of both physics, science more broadly, philosophy, and how to pull this together into a viable new 21st century natural philosophy, of which my work on Tying the Gordian knot is a effort towards that objective. I struggle over some 35 years, and we've just heard from from Federico and Bernard, excellent examples of really state-of-the-art efforts toward the contribution to such a natural philosophy. And so, and then in the scientific methodology, in part, I took some philosophy courses in college and then really did quite a bit of philosophy readings for several decades and struggling with those issues. I'm not a philosopher as such, but I've learned it, as a secondary thing. I ended up doing over 30 papers in philosophy and 3 books, so I guess it's kind of a runaway hobby. The real philosopher here is Ruth Kastner, who's worked in philosophy and physics. But out of that effort, I came to realize that we should be thinking in terms of 3 ways of knowing, and that in the scientific work, you sets of propositions, efforts at doing various observations and experiments to constrain your variables, and setting up models and putting those into quantitative form, ultimately equations that we might think are sort of physical laws, and that are somehow God-given, definite, and enduring. But always in this methodology, trying to see what we're seeking is relations of these variables and expressions of them that are independent of context, so that Newton's law or the Schrödinger equation or other formalism can be applied here on planet Earth or in Andromeda or Mars when we get to Mars, and in a way that's independent of the context. It's, so to speak, a goal of scientific representation, and that's why symmetry is so central. Symmetry principles provide a way to assure such context independence in the formulation of these relations. Nevertheless, on any given situation, any given problem, any given experiment, not only is there particular input-output, but there's always the input-output context of the boundary conditions, the initial conditions, the setting, and so forth. But we then, in the scientific process, try to focus on those elements of things, those sets of relationships and models that can achieve the context independence. So that's the way of knowing, that is the way of context, the way of numbers. Scientism tells you that that's all there is. The way of numbers is it. Okay, no, it's not, because we have a way of context focus that is the great oral poets of the past, poets of the present, arts and humanities, much of our normal everyday work of communication, of emphasizing context, the embeddedness of ourselves in family and community. This is emphasizing context. So we're in the way of numbers, we focus on dyadic relations, give an A, B, and the dyadic relations that gets embodied in a quantitative description in terms of is the experiment resulting in the yes or no or 1 or 0. But instead, there's a range. There's a range of possibility. It's yes, no, or maybe, and the in between. So there's context there that the quantum physics illustrates or embodies that there's more than just simply the dyadic relations. So then that second way, the way of context, the way of signs, semiotics, which is the theory of signs. So here we have the way of context independence, the way of numbers. The second way is the way of emphasis of context. And there's fundamental logic and philosophic arguments as to why there has to be a third, that is ultimate context. Spiritual phenomena. Linkages to a whole, an inclusiveness, existence, capital E. So that's another matter. But if you think in terms of context independence, emphasis on context, ultimate context. So then we had in a history of thought for the past couple of centuries, in the 19th century, from the developments of Newton, we came to realizing how very effective the Newtonian formalism was. And right to today, realize that classical physics is outstandingly successful for providing ways to go to the moon, to set up the trajectory, to successfully with NASA spacecraft and ESA, where we can get to Jupiter and do the orbital injection, do that successfully. And for a lot of problems for which the classical approximation is very effective. But now we have found in the past few decades ever more that the classical approximation is an approximation. So now in the 19th century, it came to be that the classical physics had arisen and became so effective in the industrial age of the 19th century that we came upon affirming a classical metaphysics that went along with that classical physics, that classical science in the 19th century. That got quite cemented in, that classical metaphysics. And then in the 20th, and then there were some questions about, well, was that physics complete? Well, gee, Thomson thought, well, maybe it's actually complete. Well, it's just a little bit to check off, and it turned out quite differently. There was a problem of atomic spectra that turned into realizing quantum physics in the early 20th century. There were problems of relationships, of space-time relations that then led us to Einstein realizing and articulating the new relativity theory. And then this then led to modern physics in the 20th century that became very successful, that led to possibilities of quantum electronics, that led to ultimately to the 8080 processor and the Z80 that our colleague here, Federico, made possible by his design. So great successes of the quantum electronics and the new quantum revolution, both quantum and relativity through. So we have this modern physics, but it turned out, so to speak, in my view, the classical metaphysics kind of got brought along, often unstated, but it kind of got brought along. So in terms of a natural philosophy in the 20th century, it's a mixed bag. It wasn't that nice, clean natural philosophy of the classical metaphysics and classical physics that were a nice marriage in the 19th century. Now in the 20th century, we have kind of a battle. We've got the modern physics that's emerging, and we've got this classical metaphysics that's been brought along, unstated, along for the ride. And then some folks in their speculations from the physics, then some of that gets brought along for the ride for example, in quantum physics. It's unclear as to, instead of a nice simple dyadic relations of given A, given then B, that you had a situation of that the measurement was unclear out of a broad distribution of what would be the result. The final actualization has to be spin up or spin down, but there's a whole range that it could be. Well, if you say, well, all of those possibilities have to be actualized, then that's a many worlds interpretation. That's taking that classical metaphysics and saying that, well, we have to stick with the notion that there is nothing but the actual, that the real is nothing but the actual. The real is nothing but the dyadic relations. And then you end up with this interpretation quantum physics that is marrying the classical metaphysics and the modern physics and giving rise to this interpretation that, in my view, is kind of ontological overflow. But now moving into, as coming into the 21st century, I think we have new possibilities for realizing that the modern physics of quantum theory and relativity theory, as we come together with, as Bernard pointed out, the possibility for bringing those together in a new way through some really important new developments, that a new integrated natural philosophy that both the physics, the science more broadly, science and the humanities, a new natural philosophy that can bring these understandings together, that can be open to psi phenomena, open to the whole range of human experience. I think that it's really possible, but we have to be careful not to buy into the scientism that assumes that the way of numbers is the only way, or buy into the notion that dyadic relations is absolutely it. We have a whole field of semiotics and biosemiotics that affirm that we always have input-output context and the correlations of those, coming from Charles Sanders Peirce and a whole century and more of development in scholarship in semiotics. Then that's reflected in the physics, recognizing that the interpretations of the quantum physics can't be simply of the Boolean logic description, that the Boolean logic, that is a logic of simple yes or no, is inadequate to cover the way in which we have a possibility space that is part of the quantum process, of which, with a given context, delimits down to a set of probable alternatives, given the limitations of a particular laboratory and experiment you're doing, out of which then the particular final measurement selects out of that to a particular actualized outcome. So you have a transition in the quantum physics from possible relations or possibilia to probabilistic ranges to a particular actualization. Possibility, probability to actuality. It's embedded in the physics itself. This is, so to speak, a counterpart to expanding our notion of the nature of the world, that the real is not just the actualized Boolean logical one or zero dyadic relations, entailment relations only, but the real world is both the actual and the possible, both a logic of the actual and a logic of the possible, both Boolean logic and non-Boolean logic. And in the quantum physics, you talk about both unitary description and non-unitary and so forth. So, and as an exemplar of that development, and who is right at the cutting edge of it, I'll turn now over to Ruth Kastner. So, Dr. Kastner.
So I'm going to be lazy and just sit here and not stand up. I'm so short that it wouldn't make any difference. Well, I mean, I want to thank the organizers for letting me be part of this. It's been amazing. And, there's been such great background in terms of, provided by the three other speakers about, why we're here and the issues we're inquiring into. And I guess, and I'm a divergent thinker. So while they're talking, I'm like, oh yeah, there's that. And I've got this whole map of like, okay, things that could be said. So I'm trying to kind of figure out, where do what should I focus on to kind of let you know how I see my contribution or my ability to support this endeavor. And I guess, just briefly as background, both my parents were scientists. My father was a solar physicist who studied the sun, specialized in very technical issues about radiation from the sun. And my mother, who's still living, is a retired math educator. So, I had a very supportive intellectual environment. They were also very kind of agnostic and logical, Mr. Spock would approve. And, well, let's be reasonable. Let's not be foolish here, figure out reasonably what's going on. So that was kind of my background. But I always
kind of had, I would say, a driving determination to figure out what is really going on here. And I think it was Paul Sirach. He has this quote, which I'm not remembering terribly clearly, but something that the scientist is driven by kind of just a shrewd sort of curiosity to find out what the hell is really going on, you know? So that's kind of been driving me. Sort of the sense that, you know, we've got kind of a world of ordinary appearance, but beneath that, there's something going on that's hidden, but it's really there. And I guess this thought kind of occurred to me or became evident when my parents would do things like bring home a prism. You know, my father dealt with the spectra from the sun. So it was very, we were taught at a very young age that white light actually has lots of colors hidden in it. And it was magic. I mean, that was enough for me. I was like, that is magic. Okay, you took this white light, you put this hunk of glass, and then all these colors came out. So at a very young age, I realized reality has these amazing, magical, hidden aspects. So that was kind of what drove me. And I ended up in physics with, I guess, the sense, perhaps naive sense, that physics is an area of study that lets us learn about these magical things. And light, right? So that's what drew me and got me into physics. And I, for a long time, was just I use the word stodgy a lot because it was a stodgy physics course of study. And I just wanted to learn about light because I thought it was cool. So I'm doing that. And then at one point, okay, I encountered quantum theory. So I start learning about, we have to learn quantum theory. And then there's this weird stuff about entanglement and non-locality. And I don't know if you've heard the EPR, Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen correlations, where if you have a couple of systems that are in a particular kind of entangled quantum state and you send them off to opposite ends of the galaxy, then somehow what someone measures in that part of the galaxy is going to have to just know about what its partner is doing on the other side in order for them to have the correct correlations. So that is, I think, where I began to realize there's something even weirder going on than I thought. So at that point, I got my master's at University of Maryland. And at that point, I found out about the philosophy department at Maryland had a group called the Committee on the History and Philosophy of Science. And they were studying, among other things, foundations of physics, where you could ask these kinds of questions about, well, what is really going on with this strange theory? Because most of the physicists, as our speakers have noted, are kind of like, oh my goodness, do not talk about that weird stuff, because we've got our preferred classical, local, mechanistic metaphysics that has to be right because that's what we want. Has to be right because that's what we do. You know, and so, but what I've been doing, okay, long story short, is in my journey to understand, you know, what quantum theory might really be telling us about reality, and as Tim has noted, that really just taking the theory seriously, if you look at its mathematical structure, it straightforwardly implies this domain of possibilities that, you know, they are not our usual either or, yes, no kinds of things. And so part of my, you know, mission, if you will, has been to try to elaborate that ontology and say, look, let's just be the technical term realist about a theory. It means that you take a particular theory and you say, okay, this theory has a mathematical structure and content. Is it just some sort of a recipe that I use to calculate stuff and go, okay, I can use some formulas. And then when I plug in, you know, my inputs to the initial conditions to this formula, I will be able to predict, at least probabilistically, what I'm going to see in the phenomenal world. And most physicists kind of treat it that way, if not voluntarily and by choice, kind of by not really admitting to it, but just because they are uncomfortable with this idea that reality may be bigger than they thought. And I often use the kind of the metaphor of an iceberg, where the tip of the iceberg is our classical phenomenal actualized reality, if you will, a sort of third person corroboratable phenomena. But the quantum theory seems to have this additional content that could be seen as referring to really what has to be called sub-empirical reality. So what I do is I say, okay, I'm just going to take that seriously, going to be realist about the theory, say that that is what it is referring to. And you know, most physicists are kind of, you know, they get out the straitjacket when I say that. Oh, there is a minority, I think a growing minority of people who are perhaps taking that more seriously. And Bernard is, I think we have a lot of common ground in that he is exploring the idea of a higher dimensionality that that I think I would argue is perhaps already there, that has the resources, that have this kind of strange non-local, global, ineffable quality already, that may provide the resources to support, in a scientific sense, these kinds of inner experiences. So that's kind of, you know, as kind of more recent participant to these conversations, I don't purport to have any specific theory of, you know, particular kinds of paranormal phenomena. But to me, physics already allows for it. It certainly is not incompatible with it. So I think, you know, I think that's something even though we have some disagreements in the specifics of, you know, what the theory would look like, even in terms of the physical theory, I think we all agree, you know, that the room is already there. And whether physics alone, I mean, physics started out as a theory about atoms, hydrogen atoms, atomic spectra. There's no, you know, obvious reason to think that it can accommodate the whole range of living and human experience. You know, I think as someone said, you know, if a dog comes running to you, is physics able to explain his behavior? I don't know. You know, so again, there's kind of, among physicists, there's this kind of arrogance that physics is the fundamental theory of everything. That may not be true. And others, Robert Rosen, a notable biologist, had argued that in fact biology may be the fundamental theory. And again, as someone who's come to physics from kind of a stodgy, you know, this is cool, I like electromagnetism standpoint, I nevertheless completely agree with Federico that on a broader philosophical level, you know, this idea that you must start with dead inanimate matter and try to build something conscious out of that is obviously ridiculous. You know, and the so-called hard problem of consciousness, which is just, you know, it's everywhere. It's like the hard problem of consciousness. I'm like, well, guys, the only reason you have a problem is you're starting with dead stuff. Just don't start with dead stuff and you have no problem. Right? So, but again, you know, like, I guess where I've had some lack of resonance is my feeling that that's a broader issue that may go beyond the, you know, the field of physics itself, that it's a metaphysical question that it's obviously resolved if you just say consciousness is in at the very basis of everything. And now, just as a little PS, you know, what my own specific work, where I get into technical issues that you can read about in my books, that I don't want to take up a lot of time here, is that in fact standard physics has, because it's been wedded to this mechanistic metaphysical picture, has actually screwed up in its description of field behavior. This is just technical, this is like boring physics stuff. But on a technical level, the fields may be doing something different than what physics tacitly assumes they have to be doing, that is actually more relational. In a very specific quantifiable sense, it's called the transactional formulation that is based on the so-called direct action theory of fields. But to make it short, this way of understanding field behavior actually involves the kind of mutuality and a non-local awareness that I think is much more in line with consciousness and with the kind of relationality that we have among living beings. So in some sense, physics has appropriated, without knowing it, this mechanistic model that has actually impeded them in solving certain problems in quantum theory itself. And my latest way of kind of understanding this is that the mechanistic picture that everyone here has criticized, rightly so, is actually, in terms of the Eastern concepts of yin and yang, is yang only. That this has not been seen because the Western mindset only sees yang. So it's this local thing about, you know, stuff goes out, the tennis serve, everything is simply an autonomous agent supposedly putting everything in motion, and everything that needs to happen happens that way. And actually some serious problems in quantum mechanics, I argue, come from the fact that that's how they think the fields behave, but they don't. There's actually field behavior that's yin-like, excuse me, cold, and that there is response. There isn't just initiation, but there is active response. So that there's a way to, it's actually a very old theory that has been around for nearly a century, but has been kind of in the margins. And so what I want to bring out in my latest, you know, way of presenting this is that yin is real, yin is active, it's crucial. We need both. We need yin and yang, and that's actually in the physics if people will let it be there. So I guess that's about all I have to say about what I've been doing.
So let me, I want to ask other people to kick in a minute, but let me just say something else here. From this conference, I mean, I certainly got a lot of encouragement that yes, there really are resources in up-to-date physics that support the kind of picture that we developed through SERSEM, this Myers-James SERSEM view of consciousness and its role in life. And we will certainly be going on to expand this effort, bring in some more people. I'll create a new item for the menu of fundable projects to support that. But I wanted to read a bit from Tim's book here. The concluding paragraph of his book says the following. In confronting the psychological challenges of nihilism, denialism, and assorted despairs of contemporary life, and facing up to the physical threats of war, pandemics, human suffering, and newly realizing the deterioration of Earth's climate, ecology, and habitability, can we somehow embrace what we have learned through science and philosophy, and what we may yet draw on from indigenous and other spiritualities, so as to bring into being a world in which we humans can live and flourish over the long term? Amen. So, Bob, Emily, Michael, Carolyn, where are you?
There she is.
Anybody else want to say more about what's happened so far? Questions? Bob, you were about to speak.
Probably not, but only that it seems to me that, in fact, metaphysics have met physics, and what we really have is a higher dimensional elephant than we thought. I would encourage everyone here to read what our presenters have published. Follow it as far as you can. A lot of it is quite comprehensible in English before you get to any of the high math. And there's a great deal to be learned. It was a wonderful weekend. It was great to hear them talk and argue and discuss and hone their points of view. I was professionally a historian of science and technology. I fell into this business half a century ago when I met Ed. And it's been like a Bernard, I've had to keep it a little bit to the side till I got involved in the CERSEM that produced those wonderful books. No, I was largely an observer at this. Great pleasure. But no, I don't think I have anything significant beyond the crack about higher dimensional health.
I guess,
Which is true.
I guess the only thing I would add is that I'm always thinking in the background that we hope to expand this. We hope to go further with it, bring in other people, but we can't be insular. We always have to be thinking about how we're going to communicate this further than just us. And so I guess that's just sort of always in the back of my mind. How are we going to get this out? How are we going to communicate it to other people besides just us talking among each other? So.
Yeah, this is the problem of what Mike Murphy refers to as social acupuncture.
Yeah.
As what are the levers available to get this out into the world at large? Carol,
I think the paradigm is shifting. There's the very beginning of it. And there are probably little nodes, places and dimensions and even fields that we don't know. I mean, like academic fields even that we don't know about. At some point, it could take a while, decade or 2 or 3. But at some point, the different those and changing perceptions, a changing paradigm will come in contact with each other. And perhaps at that point, the paradigm will flip faster than we anticipate.
I think
What will happen, I don't know, but I think there's a sense of gathering, change and recognition, at least in this country. I can't speak to Europe, China. It's a very optimistic moment, even though I don't think I'll live to see the flip.
well, in connection with talking about these different nodes and stuff, I just want to give real credit to somebody like Mike Murphy, who has spent his whole life bringing nodes together. And then I also want to give credit to Ed on maybe a smaller scale for bringing different nodes together to instead of being this insular pursuit of this and insular pursuit of that, bringing these nodes together to bear on each other. Absolutely. Yeah.
I used to think of us, in parapsychology as being like trying to steer the Titanic from a rowboat, and you can imagine but now there are more rowboats.
Yeah.
Just get them together.
It's tugboats.
Yeah.
My
Our
thought
hostess.
that just came up to me is that going forward, when you're writing and communicating and developing theories, whatever, that you be really careful about the language that you use, particularly the higher realms and the higher whatever, because you don't want the scientists and whatever who are based in materialism and whatever to feel like they're part of the lower, the baser, whatever. So be really careful about the language you use. And, make sure that there's room for everybody in the conversation.
Yeah.
And everyone is valued in the conversation. There's no distinction.
Actually, I have a
Like
question based off
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah.
So my question is, and this might be really dumb because I don't know, I'm not a scientist at all, but I appreciated what everyone said and I feel like it was fascinating. But what is the pushback? Like I don't know your community, but when you talk about, you're passionate about these things and what guided you towards this, studying this and I kind of was feeling like there is physics and then there's what you guys are doing. I obviously see it as being intertwined, but what's the problem with physics people? Why aren't they, I mean, you guys are obviously that community too, but because you all know, it seems that you know the academic you know, fundamentals, but then you're like, there's more here. What are people in that world saying that is not accepting or like?
If I could, I
Yeah.
don't know, well, maybe we all want to go, oh my God, there's so much, I don't know where to begin. There's pushback just in terms of how to interpret the physical theory. I mean, you know, I feel like I'm endlessly repeating myself here, but you guys haven't heard it yet. These guys are going, oh God, there she goes again. For instance, a direct, if you want to be realist about quantum theory and just want to say, well, the theory must be describing the world, you automatically get pushback from physicists about that because they will say, Hilbert space is not real. What's wrong with you? And because it's got a weird mathematical character that doesn't line up with space-time. Now, the other thing is everyone thinks, and the prevailing assumption of physics is that everything physically real is in a space-time container. That's a ground assumption. It's literally wrong according to their own theory of general relativity. In general relativity, matter is not in the gravitational field, which is the metrical space-time. So it's like you point physicists, excuse me, your theory says that all matter objects that have rest mass, so that's not photons, but atoms, everything, it's literally not in space-time, guys. You don't even have to go to quantum theory to see that that is true. And you know, there's pushback on that because we're stupid. Obviously, we live in a space-time container. So this is what's so weird about it is and it's very convincing that we live in a space-time container, isn't it? But it's our user interface. So if you think back to Copernicus, okay, remember several centuries ago when we were all there in our past lives, you're there and you literally see the sun going around the earth. That's apparently the empirical observation. Look, I see the sun going around the earth, Galileo. Get out the straitjacket for Galileo. No, actually, it's not true. And it's the same kind of paradigm shift. We see that we're in a space-time container, but we're not. You know, so it's crazy. It's crazy. So that's the short answer. You're going to get pushback just because a physicist will not face up to the hard line implications of their very own theories.
So it's space-time containerism, space-time as a container, dyadic relations only, orientate things in terms of substance only, not in terms of processes and events. These are all characteristics of classical metaphysics that is dominant in the 19th century and continues into the 20th century. Yeah.
Let me give a little different kind of answer to this. The physicalism that I talked about at the beginning is a philosophical position that's grounded in the physics of the late 19th century. It has nothing to do with the sort of stuff that Ruth is talking about. And unfortunately, that's the worldview that most people in mainstream science, in particular things like biology, neuroscience, psychology, the behavioral sciences generally, let alone the humanities, that's what they think is the correct science-based picture of the world. And for many of these people, it amounts to a secular faith. They don't like heresy. You know, people feel that their entire lives are being threatened by people who talk about this.
Yeah,
that's the
underlying cause.
A lot of anxiety.
Can I add something here? Because, I mean, Ruth was arguing at a rather specific level of disagreement. And of course, within physics itself, physicists are always disagreeing about things. Within cosmology, there's huge disagreements. But the issue is much deeper than that. The issue in this particular context is simply that many physicists, and I say scientists, it's not just a matter of physicists, simply don't believe the phenomena we're actually trying to explain, or at least they don't believe the phenomena we're trying to explain have anything to do with physics. And for example, there was an article by two gentlemen, Reber and Alcock, who are psychologists, basically saying these phenomena cannot be real. I mean, psychic phenomena can't possibly be real because they're incompatible with physics.
Which is false.
And therefore, we don't even have to look at the data. We don't even have to look through the telescope. And as I said, I think in my introductory remarks, that's an absurd thing to say because we don't know what the final theory of physics is anyway. But that's the basic problem, that people don't, many physicists simply don't believe in the phenomenon. Now, I have to say the problem isn't that really that bad, because if you talk to physicists privately, and I am a physicist, I have friends who are physicists, they're not all, convinced that these phenomena don't exist. I mean, in fact, you'll talk to people individually, they say, yes, of course, I've had those experiences too. But I can't talk about it as my colleague over there will think that I'm crazy. And then you go to the colleague over there and he'll say, yes, I've had it, but I can't talk to the colleague over there. So if really physicists are more open than you might think. But what you've got to realize that in physics, as in all of science, research now is incredibly narrowly focused. There's this huge exponentiation of knowledge, which means you can only make an important contribution to a subject if you focus really very narrowly. And so you have to sort of decide whether you're going to know everything about nothing or nothing about everything. And actually, so when I talk to my physics colleagues, my friends, by and large, I don't try and persuade them that they should get interested in this subject, because I realize they're trying to make a career for themselves. They've got to focus on whatever it is, plasma physics or solar physics or whatever, or semiconductor physics. I mean, because that's the practical way of the world. They have that you simply don't. You can't keep up with all these things. So I never get annoyed when physicists say they don't have time to be interested in these phenomena. I only get annoyed when they say, I've not looked at the evidence, I've not had the experience, and it's rubbish. That's what really annoys me. And there is a large group of people who take that view. It's called scientism as opposed to science. No one is against the basic principles of science and the methodology of science. It's this very narrow, almost fundamentalist view of science, called scientism, which says that all that exists is the material world, and that nothing else is real or interesting.
Thank you for answering.
And they have power because these scientism has, people have lost their jobs. Because of this. It's a sort of war going on. It's being raged through Wikipedia, for example. Whenever any of us, if you see our entries in Wikipedia, you'll see they've been doctored by the
vigilantes.
These vigilantes.
Well, as we know in parapsychology, they also control the funding.
And they control, yeah. Anyway, that's
I was
rather
gonna say, it's like Mueller and Scully. You guys are like, your basement bigger than the cool stuff.
Yeah.
The real
I like that.
from the X-Files. I don't know if anyone.
Yes, I love that.
And that's interesting because in the general public, there's a huge interest in these subjects. And we give popular talks on these subjects. You get huge numbers of people saying, yes, that's my experience.
Yeah, but people in the general public have been, at least for all the years I've been in this field, are afraid to talk about their experiences. I think they're becoming less afraid.
Less so, yeah, less.
Even people in the general public, I think, are afraid because of what they will say about,
That's true.
I mean, I had I had this wonderful experience years ago when I went to interview a woman about her near-death experience. And I got there and she took me aside before we came and she said, I had to tell my husband about who you were and why you were coming because I had never told him about my near-death experience. And her husband, had a near-death experience and had never told her.
Yeah.
Husband and wife.
Oh my.
And I remember a lovely story. Someone was talking about near-death experiences to a huge audience about the reality of near-death experiences. And there was a surgeon, a heart surgeon in the audience. And he said, all of this is rubbish. I've been doing heart surgery all my life and I've never had any of my patients report one of these experiences. And then a little hand went out from somebody and said, I was one of your patients and I did have a near-death experience and you're the last person I would have told.
If you read the last part of Tim's book, and it raises a question for me because we can't change the world using the old ways we have been thinking to get where we are. And Tim, you are suggesting that there might be some other ways. Indeed, you are. what ideas do you have about how we can use what we're talking about here to make the world a better place as you have described and need to?
Well, that's such an enormous subject, of course, and we're
Subject of
really not
Conference.
very well equipped to answer it. I mean, we should really be looking around for possible helpers in doing this more effectively. I really could barely even begin on an answer to that. Certainly, we keep doing the work we're doing, try to make it available to a larger public, but we're very unskilled in how to do these things. Traditionally been a huge
And I
problem.
think Carolyn's right. I think this is going to be a process and we may not live to see it.
Yeah. We're on the winning team, but we may not.
No, this road anyway.
Federico and his interpretation. I'm a physicist too, but I've been retired so long I don't have to talk technical. To answer your question, I would like to read 2 paragraphs from the end of Federico's book, which may seem really off the wall, but this book is real science. This book explains how we can adopt a new way of thinking without throwing out any science, right, Federico? And there is science, a lot of science in here, and you won't read a prettier description of the evolution of quantum mechanics, just for instance. But let me read from the very end, a piece called Union is in the Heart. I think that the positive forces that will create our future not be the forces and laws of matter, but those of conscious cooperation, comprehension, and love for others that all beings in existence must sooner or later manifest, because these values are the essence of our deepest nature. I also think that the most effective way to achieve union is through a process of collective, cooperative creation of a just, empathic, and loving society through right and courageous actions informed by the heart and by the intuitive and rational mind. Then our experience and knowing will grow in our hearts. They will guide our individual actions through an ever higher level of consciousness. It goes on. Okay.
Thank you.
This is a great book. This is a great.
I didn't pay her.
I have a preprint that's all marked up, and if I had, this is a new copy that Federico just gave me. If I had my preprint here, I would have been able to pick the absolute best. This is the book I go to when I'm feeling down, and I just can open to a random page and read 3 pages. My day.
This one's called Irreducible, not Irreducible Mind. Unlike Silicon, his other book.
If I could comment as another reader of Federico's book, I think part 1 of that book may have a lot of impact on biologists. He's basically attempting to convince them that they must abandon their reliance on classical models and take into account the properties of quantum systems in order to understand organisms.
Question back there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I got the impression that everybody wants to get this idea out more, but at the same time, it's such a private event. I was just lucky to know about it. I'm just so glad here, but I wonder is how many people out there really would love to hear this discussion and everything. And if your intention is to get it out to the community, why is it not promote more?
Funding. That's good to get more funding. They have awesome YouTube videos. I watch all the YouTubes. I don't know.
No, I would add to this that think about high school. Think about your education. Think about everybody who's learning science, because people take what they learn as given, the same way that most people hark back to 4th grade or 9th grade when they want to talk about what's proper grammar. Well, I was taught that you don't split infinitives. I was taught this, and they take it as a given. That's just how it is. People are learning physics and biology and chemistry, and they're learning, in many cases, good science, but they're not learning that there's anything in the world beyond it. And in fact, I would bet a nickel that if you go to the introduction of most of the textbooks that they're using, they'll lay out that this is how you understand the world. Changing the educational system so that you get the kids before what I know he didn't make this up, but I heard from Ed the expression, the hardening of the categories, which happens later. But before that, you have to get to people. The reason that all the psychologists and other social scientists think in terms of 19th century physics is that the last physics they took. That's how the world works. It's billiard balls. So there's a lot of work to be done, but if the general culture shifts and you get enough people who are teaching, who don't subscribe to a simple 19th century physical world, things might shift.
And also say that I think there's a distinction between getting the message to the outside world and getting the message out to the academics, and in particular the scientists who are a subset. And those are different tasks. And it seems clear to me that if you want to convince the outside world, what you do is you write a book. And because you can hold all these conferences and specialized discussions, that won't affect the outside world. But all of my colleagues here have written great books on this subject. I must confess I haven't, but what I've noticed is that until you write a book, people don't really hear in the outside world. But on the other hand, you've also got to realize that even writing a book only gets noticed if it's successful, if it gets promoted. I mean, my supervisor and friend Stephen Hawking, his book, Brief History of Time, was a phenomenal. It sold 10 million copies. But the reason is not because it was such a great book, but because it was promoted. And I was talking about this to Federico. He's written a great book, and I'm sure, I hope it will be promoted, and you've helped in the promotion. Thank you for that. But I was speaking to somebody just a few nights ago who's involved in making movies. And nowadays he says that, a typical movie costs $100 million, but you have to spend $100 million to promote it in order that people watch it. And I've never realized that. And I think it's the same with books, that if you've got to write a great book, but you've also got to put a huge amount of effort into promoting it, which is actually expensive too. I mean, the publisher has to decide this book is worth promoting, and then it may be a bestseller. And but on the other hand, if he doesn't, then the book won't be a bestseller. So the question of how you promote an idea is quite complicated, and it's actually expensive, and it involves a lot of strategy.
Can I ask a more technical question? I want to say first, I really appreciate hearing all of you one after another talking about your specific perspectives, because I think, when I've read your work individually, I usually, spend a whole day or a week on that specific theory, and hearing just, a bit of each theory, all of them juxtaposed, very helpful to me and provoked a question. So one of the things that I've been skeptical about with the hyperspatial theories or the hyperdimensional spatial theories is that I've always felt like, Ruth was saying, space-time isn't fundamental. Like, how would other dimensions explain psi phenomena if that's not even fundamentally what's going on in reality? But then Ruth was mentioning direct action theory. And I wondered if you guys have had conversation this week about that, and what you think, Bernard, about a direct action sort of foundation for hyperdimensional theories. Do you think that those are compatible with?
Yes, I do think they're compatible. I mean, first of all, I should say that the idea of hard dimensions comes from physics itself. And in fact, Dorothy, in her question, raised the point about physicists might be unhappy referring to higher dimensions, but I should stress that the concept of higher dimensions comes from physicists themselves. So, but,
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I do believe, as you do, that there are these dimensions and, you know, some of them might be higher or whatever, but I just sort of feel like in your language, you might not want to make that distinction.
Just has
And say
connotation.
that, and just use different terminology that has less judgment. let's say.
yeah,
It has a
but anyway, I mean,
Yeah.
but that's the terminology that physicists
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
use. But to answer your question, I also want to stress that not all physicists believe in higher dimensions. So I don't want to give the impression, and certainly those physicists who are interested in higher dimensions, like M theorists, aren't going to support the sort of theory I'm talking about, which is saying these higher dimensions can accommodate mental and spiritual phenomena. So I don't want to give the impression this is definitely the right way to go. However, the way I go, and you asked the question how it relates to what Ruth was talking about, indeed what Federico was talking about, I think there is compatibility. I mean, of course, most people are tending to focus on the quantum explanation of psychic and spiritual phenomena because there seems to be, for the first time in physics, consciousness can enter into the picture. But actually, it's not only in some sense. So you might think this hyperspatial approach is in contrast to the quantum approach, but I believe that this unified theory is going to be a unified. It will provide a unified understanding of both quantum theory and mentality, because no one understands quantum theory as a conceptual level anyway. It works, but as people keep saying, it seems to be crazy. But there must be a deeper theory, and that deeper theory underlies both quantum theory and relativity theory, and in my view, my hope at least, it will underlie, it will not just underlie consciousness, but consciousness will underlie it. And in fact, even in her talk, although she didn't talk about it, I was so excited because Ruth was talking about applications of higher dimensions in explaining some of these phenomena. So I don't think there's any clash between what we're saying. I think it's complementary. Likewise with Federico, he himself refers to higher dimensions. He's referring to the higher dimensions in quantum theory, which is what we call the Hilbert space. So it's a slightly different concept. But personally, I think these things are related. And obviously, I don't know whether Ruth and Federico want to comment on that.
Well, a little bit of a follow-on. Coming into the conference and the sessions, I've often been a skeptic of higher dimensional representation in terms of, say, the actualized world and all that. And Ruth argues and emphasizes, and I think that really is a good point about we literally live in a quantum world, and the classical world is an approximation to that. The real world is a quantum world. It's quantum land. Nice phrase from a book of Ruth about quantum land. And in the quantum land, we've got, like she showed the iceberg metaphor. But we, in our actualized world, right here in the room, we're kind of directly seeing the portion of the iceberg above the water. But then there is this pre-space domain of potentia and the subquantum level, the hidden, the veiled reality. And there's a lot of that is much more than that reality than the particular portion that's actualized. So it's part of a presentation.
Yeah. So it's deeper in a sense. So I mean, you could say the terminology. Sorry to interrupt. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that as a way of thinking about, or
Yeah.
potentially that representations of that veiled reality might end up being very useful in helping to understand the consciousness issue going forward. That's where I see its greatest potential.
And it just in terms of Helen's concern, in that kind of way of looking at it, it's foundational. It's sort of the deeper reality. So even though, I mean, that you could say the term higher dimensionality then has just a very narrow sense in terms of the number of dimensions is of a higher number. So you know, again, I understand your concern about the connotations of saying it's a higher dimensional reality. And it's a good point to note, you know, the use of language in that it can have an inadvertent effect on people that you don't want. But the interesting thing is that, I mean, the term higher dimensionality is really just referring to there are more dimensions, the number's higher, but they actually can be understood as foundational.
You mentioned the space-time continuum. The first time I ever heard the phrase space-time continuum is dead was from an author, scientist, Donald Hoffman, and then I heard you mention interface theory. I just wondered if you hold any credence to some of his, Don Hoffman's theories of user interfaces, the reality that we see.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm saying is really pretty much very close to what Hoffman is saying. I mean, and I guess kind of when he'll say things like there is no reality and so it's kind of, to me, that's a bit misleading because yes, of course there's reality. It's just different than what you think. And the phenomenal world, there's a strange language thing where people call the world of appearance, which I'm identifying with just the tip of the iceberg, they call that reality. And the whole point is that isn't the whole reality. It's a phenomenal, you know, extract or just condensate. And yes, reality is real. It's just very different from what you think.
Let's just. The thought that just came to me is that, you know, instead of focusing on, you know, what we've learned so far, what we think is real, whatever, maybe focusing on the why, like, why do we have these properties of science here? And yes, there are other dimensions, other realms, whatever you want to call it, where there's more information, right? But why are we here in this world, in this body, on this planet, at this particular moment in time? And I really feel it's to manifest. And we need the physical world. We need these physical bodies. We need this place and this time in order to manifest something. But we also need to draw on the information from all these other realms and these higher dimensions and whatever that play a role in what we're manifesting, what we're using our free will to do and to make decisions and to interact and to be in this world.
May I comment on this one? You know, science is not interested in the why. They're interested in the how, especially physics. Physics will never, I mean, if you ask a physicist, you know, why is there energy? If it's, what are you talking about? You know, and energy is what creates motion, you know, and you say, but why is there motion? Oh, that's what energy creates. You see what I mean? You know, in other words, in the way in which you write an equation, you put two terms, okay, that are essentially reflecting each other. There is a sort of circularity in the logic of physics, but primarily because we don't want to ask why. But we ask why. It's consciousness that asks why. And consciousness is really beyond what science today deals with. So that's why we need a space where this reality is. We know already that quantum physics requires Hilbert space, which is a mathematical space, to describe the state. And the state of the field, for example, is not something that can be separated from the field. It's not like an electron is a state of the field of electrons, but you cannot separate it. So the state of the field is integral. It's a property of the field. It's not a property of the electron. one of the major confusion among scientists, even scientists that know quantum physics, they think that the particles exist. They actually think that they are real little balls that moves around independently of the field. Then you tell them that no, that's not what the other physicists are saying. Well, but we doesn't matter because we, you know, that's what the way they work anyway. You know, I mean, there is essentially a physicist is not generally interested in a problem of the why. Is interested in how does it work, and what can I do with it if I understand how it works. You know, can I get something out of it, and so on. The practical aspects, and the moment that you say, you know, in order to accommodate consciousness, you have to have at least a multidimensional space and a kind of time that is not necessarily the time of that we measure with the clock, in a reality that contains this stuff. Because, you know, what I feel within me for a while until I have an experience of out of body. Now, what I feel is out there. I don't feel the body is over here, but I feel over there. If I have a near-death experience, I'm not in the body. In fact, the body doesn't even work because in a near-death experience, the body is clinically dead. It's not so dead it cannot be resuscitated, but it's essentially clinically dead. The heart doesn't beat, the brain doesn't have any signals. So how can the consciousness be up there looking down at the body, or even worse, in some other space or reality where that person meets the parents that are dead, that have been dead for years. So clearly death then is not a property of consciousness. It must be a property of the body, but not of consciousness. Well, if you tell this to a scientist, they tell you know, where's the, I give you the number of the nearest psychiatrist, right? So I mean, that is considered crazy, you know, and besides the problem of death or life is one of the fundamental problems that also matters to us, you know, never mind, you know. And so what I'm trying to say is that we have to go beyond the point that today's science is to basically neglecting everything that we cannot explain based on the theories that we have. And that's the major problem that we have today, that scientists don't want to deal with problems, you know, with evidence that they cannot prove right or wrong. But unfortunately, there are hundreds of thousands of people that have near-death experiences. There are millions of people that have out-of-body experiences. So how do we explain that? They don't care because, you know, the point is their careers, their mindset, their callings, what they think of. All those things are much more important than solving this problem. But today, then, scientists are telling us that AI will be better than us in 20 years. That a computer will be conscious. And they say that because that follows logically from their premises. But their premises have already eliminated consciousness, free will, and everything that matters to us. Because if you start with matter, how can you get consciousness? And on it goes, right? So the problem today is to wake up the scientific community that believes not in science with the big capital S, but in scientism, which is the problem that we have today. Most people, even when they solve problems that are not of the scientism, when they think about how the world works, the only model that they have that is sort of self-consistent is the scientific model. Or what do you say, scientific? Scientific model.
That's right.
In other words, they resort to, well, you know, because this banks that and this, that, you know, and that's inconsistent with even the principle of physics. There is nothing that banks against anybody else.
Can I add something to this? Because I think to address your question of the why, I think that the worldview that we're moving towards in what we're doing, this evolutionary pantheism, does address the why. And I'd like to leave it to Ed and Federico maybe to explicate that a little more. But basically, evolutionary panentheism is saying that there's this undifferentiated one that is the why is to differentiate into all these experiences to broaden one and be the one and the many at the same time. So I'm not saying this very well, and I think the two of them can say it better. Yeah, okay.
In my theory, I start.
Let me give a preamble to this, because I think it's important to emphasize that that science does not provide the way of knowing to give for everything. All meaning, all reality is not embodied in science alone. It's one way of knowing, and it's a way of knowing that emphasizes trying to represent things in a way that's independent of context. There are other realities of the world that we all know and experience and feel. The way of context emphasis, the way of meaningfulness, of interpretation, of philosophy, humanities, art, these are real. It's in addition to certain realities we associate with science. To reduce all that to nothing but a scientific proposition is scientism, and we all deny that. We all oppose that here at this table. And I appeal to, we have reference to ultimate context as a third aspect of the total range of ways of knowing in the fullness of reality. And so Federico is providing an expression for how consciousness is a great exemplar of something that breaks out of the bounds of force-fitting things into shoehorning things into nothing but simplistic scientific descriptions, especially in the classical metaphysics mode, but in a much more inclusive framework that you've articulated.
Yeah, so my framework starts with a postulate. And the postulate is very simple. One, the totality of what exists. So it's defined as the totality of what exists, not God, none of the totality of what exists. Is dynamic, meaning it's never the same instant after instant. We know that. Reality is like that. Is holistic, means it's not made of separable parts. Okay. I describe the universe of quantum physics right now, and also relativity. I add one covenant, one more thing. One wants to know itself. One wants to know itself. Now, in order to know itself, it must have the will, which is from which free will is part, it derives, so to speak, and must be conscious. So consciousness is the capacity to know itself. So as simple as that, consciousness is the capacity to want to know itself. So once you start that way, what do we have? Now, first of all, what is the why of existence? One wants to know itself, and we are generated by one, have the same desire to know ourselves. This postulate combines science and spirituality, combines the inner reality with the outer reality. The inner reality is the reality of meaning, the reality of comprehension, the reality of inner experience. Is a semantic reality. The outer reality, the one of symbols, is the syntactic reality. In other words, is the stuff that you can measure, the stuff that is shareable. Because the inner reality, as I said earlier, cannot be shared. It's private. And that's exactly what quantum physics is saying. You cannot reproduce a quantum state. So this starting point combines, in fact, I say integrates science, physics, but physics is the foundation of science, and spirituality, which is the foundation of the fact that we feel, that we know, that we have meaning, that we want to know ourselves, blah, 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 right? So here we go.
Can I just I get so excited by Federico. I a postscript because it's always amazed me. You've got this one mind, as Federico refers to it. I think that's something we all share. There is one consciousness of which we are a part. And I'm always obsessed, especially recent, with the question, well, why is this one consciousness fragmented into these 8 billion minds on this planet? And that's only humans and only this planet. And I've become obsessed with, why am I me instead of Federico? And it seems to me that I thought Emily put it very nicely that of course, one can't really answer the question why we're here, but it seems to me that the reason has to be that by fragmenting itself into these billions of individual minds, these billions of different perspectives, the universe, the one consciousness can come to understand itself by experiencing the universe in all these different perspectives and from all these different ways. The universe comes to understanding itself, and I do see because I'm a cosmologist, I've seen how the universe evolves, and it does seem to me that the universe is evolving not just on a physical level, but also on a mental and spiritual level, and this is.
I think a big.
So when you say, why are we here? It seems to me, in some sense, that's the reason we're trying to get to know ourselves, just as Federico said.
And I think a big part of evolutionary pantheism is the evolutionary part. It's almost more than the one wanting to know itself. It's the one evolving, continually, eternally evolving into something else, as well as knowing
because
yeah.
one is not omniscient like most gods of religions, right? Omniscience would mean that God already knows everything. But in fact, in this definition, one wants to know itself because it doesn't know itself yet.
But it's not just a question of
desire to know itself. In order to know itself, it must create entities like us.
But I think what I'm saying is that it's not just a question of knowing. It's not just a question of knowing. It's a question of being. So it's becoming something else as well as
but
knowing.
knowing creates what you know. So existence and knowing are two aspects of the same thing.
Right.
This is a big part of.
I think a good time to bring in the concept of the safety related to the quantum field into one.
That's kind of too detailed for this. Let me, we're past our time. Let me end by kind of reframing this in the context of the history of psychology. My belief is that Myers and James and some of their colleagues were well on the way toward a picture of the sort that Federico has just outlined. And regrettably, his body was barely in its grave when James B. Watson issued in 1913 the Behaviorist Manifesto. If you go back and look at that thing, and really every student of these subjects ought to be required to do that, it is absolutely bizarre. It basically takes an aspect of consciousness from science. And what's even more bizarre than that is that so many able people took it so seriously for so long. I mean, when I began graduate school in the 1960s, you didn't say the word consciousness in polite scientific company. That's how bad it was. And it's only recently that it's come back in. And even now, most of what goes on in psychology and neuroscience is the same old stuff. So what I see us doing collectively, not just us, but the whole community of psychical researchers and our new allies in physics and philosophy, is getting back to where they were and moving the subject forward in a more interdisciplinary kind of way.
One short thing is, you talked before about a book that's a bestseller, and we should write a book about why is the peacock beautiful. It's Darwin has been up and down, and science is respected, not respected. And this is a scientific proof why he has his long feathers, for he can't fly anymore, and why he has his 3 feathers up here, for he has the conscience of being beautiful.
Can we give one more round of applause? And Ed would say to be continued.
Yes.
Thank you all so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.